Austerity? What austerity? We haven't seen any austerity. Government expenditure is still increasing, and the government is actually spending far more than it's taking in taxation. For every £5 it takes in taxation, it spends 6 and borrows 1. So the national debt is still rising. The deficit is 120 billion a year. The national debt, which in 2010 was just about 900 billion, is going to rise to 1,600 billion by 2015. That's not austerity at all. If you or I were in debt as deep as the government, we'd be cutting back much more than this.
Okay, so if the government's got to cut back more, it's got to cut back, presumably, in terms of government expenditure, what areas should the government cut back on?
I think we need a zero-based budgeting policy. We need to look at public expenditure and work out what is government there for? What is it that's absolutely essential about government that we can't do without? And focus your resources on those things. The fact is that government expenditure is about 50% higher now than it was 10 years ago. Are we getting 50% more value from that? I don't think so, because we're spending it on marginal things. So I think that you need to look at the whole of government expenditure, and actually probably you should be cutting out complete ministries, never mind just individual programs.
If we look at the 3 biggest components of public expenditure in the UK, they are education, health and pensions. Should they be in the private sector? Would you cut back in those 3 areas to reach your objectives?
Health, education and pensions, welfare, all of that should be delivered privately. We don't have a national clothes service. Clothes are essential. But we don't provide them through some government monopoly. We give people who can't afford clothes, we give them the money to buy clothes with. The same sort of thing should happen in health and in education. That in health probably you need an insurance system whereby the government pays the premiums of people who can't afford it themselves. In education, frankly, I'm not sure that we even need a Department of Education. I think that if you look around the world, even the poorest parents in the poorest countries make sure that their children are educated. If you do need anything, it is to make sure that the poorest people can afford that. You don't need a government agency to provide education any more than you need a government agency to provide shoes. As for pensions, yes, this is a complete Ponzi scheme which is run by the government. It's just like every other pension scheme in the world, just about. Governments promise benefits and they don't worry too much about how they're going to be paid for because they'll be paid for by future taxpayers. So the pension that I will draw in a few years will be paid by my children and then by my grandchildren. That is not the right way to run a pension system. We need something where we're saving for ourselves in individual accounts so that we can see what we're doing and that it gives us the incentive to do a bit more than we're perhaps doing at the moment.
One argument that you put forward is that it was a binge that caused the crisis in the first place, and one argument that was a private sector binge, it was private sector debt, and it was fueled by irresponsible banks. So it's really the free market that caused the problems.
This is a crisis which is caused by government. It isn't caused by bankers, it isn't caused by free markets. It is caused by the governments of the world spending far too much, hoping that their books will balance in future years, but never actually making them balance today, flooding the world with liquidity when any threat or crisis looms on the horizon, keeping interest rates low in order to try to stimulate growth so that they look better at election time. When you have that, then naturally, at low interest rates, people are going to borrow as much as they possibly can. If you subsidize houses, people are going to buy the biggest houses they possibly can. This is what governments in Britain and America have done. This is why we've had an enormous boom. We've had a fantastic party, and what we're enjoying now, or not enjoying, is the hangover. And that hangover is an inevitable consequence of that profligacy by politicians and central bankers throughout the Western world.
If governments borrow to fund capital expenditure rather than current expenditure, is that acceptable?
In principle, government borrowing to fund capital expenditure is perfectly acceptable. If you believe that the wealth of the nation is going to be increased in the future by spending on something now, like roads or airports or rail systems, well, fine. In principle, that is justified. I think the trouble is that it's very difficult to know what is actually capital investment and what is expenditure. We've heard politicians talk about investment in the health service. What they mean is consumption, that we're spending more in the health service because we're actually enjoying more services from the health service. That's not investment, that is consumption. And this is a sort of sleight of hand which goes on in political circles, which makes me very suspicious at all of any government borrowing. I really would prefer that we put serious levels on the amount of debt that governments could hold and the amount of the size of the deficit that they could run. If we can get that to as near zero as possible, I think that would be a thoroughly good thing for this country and every other country, not now, but in the future as well.
How would you view the role of the government in the economy to be in the future to ensure that the British economy was successful and we had prosperity for all people?
Government has an essential role in a market economy, which is to maintain the rules by which the market economy functions. Rules of competition, rules of ownership, contract, the administration of justice, things like that. Most of the rest can actually be done by ordinary individuals and private businesses. It doesn't need a government to deliver hospitals and health, or to deliver education. Private institutions can do those. The focus of government ought to be on welfare and civics, making sure that we live in a fair and just society, and making sure that people who are on low incomes or have little wealth get access to the same sorts of goods that everybody else can get, and the same services that everybody else can get. So that should be the focus on government, not trying to direct the economy, not trying to second guess where business people should invest their funds, not trying to run industries themselves, but just simply making it possible for other people to do their own thing in their own way. If they did that, I think we'd all be very much better off. I'm distressed to say that I have grave doubts about our democracy. I'm thinking of writing a book called One Cheer for Democracy. We all believe in it, but it only works if it's limited. You can't run a democracy by giving your politicians unlimited power to do anything they want. That's pretty much the situation we have at the moment. We don't have a democracy, we have an elected dictatorship. And if they decide that we can't smoke, or that we can't drink, or that we can't have soda pop in bottles of more than half a litre, then that becomes the law. Now, that kind of power is a way of exploiting minorities. Certainly when it comes to taxation, we have seen this, where people are told that, yes, we need to raise more taxes, but we'll raise them off the rich. In other words, it's going to be somebody else who's paying the tax. It's a recipe for exploitation, and I don't think that you can run a country like that.
Actually, we see very many different democracies with very different roles of the state. In some countries, such as the US, the state is relatively small. For other countries, such as the Nordic countries, the state is relatively big. There are different sorts of democracies with different roles of government. Don't countries and electorates choose the sort of governments they want to live in? And sometimes that may mean big government, and sometimes that may mean small government.
People often talk about Sweden, Finland, Norway as examples of countries which have managed to run their economies perfectly happily, with lots of decisions being made by the government rather than by individuals. Well, yes, of course. That's perfectly natural because they're rather homogeneous countries. They're predominantly white, they're predominantly Scandinavian. We don't live in a country like that. America isn't a country like that. In countries where you have a great mix of people of different origins and different views, then it's hard to make decisions centrally. You're always going to be making decisions which are bad for some particular group and not good for the whole community. So it's true that if a country is diverse, there are fewer things which you can actually effectively and indeed legitimately do by deciding them at the centre. And I think Britain is a very diverse country. I think we need to make our own decisions, choose our own life goals and our own culture and religion and the way that we live. I don't think that should all be decided by government. So democracy, yes, is a thoroughly good thing, but you have to have limits on it so that governments can't use it to simply exploit people that they don't happen to agree with.